Well, good morning, everybody. It's Wednesday, and you're not Donald Trump. And for that, I suppose you can be thankful. You're not Tanya Chutkin either. At least I don't think you are. If you're listening, Tanya, I'm surprised. Um, Lots going on yesterday. Argument in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia about the scope of presidential immunity and disappointing headlines, candidly, in news reports on it. I'm in my office writing a difficult brief and doing what all good procrastinators do when they're doing something difficult that is doing something difficult, looking for distractions. So I go to my news feed and, Trump's lawyers assert he can assassinate rivals. And I'm like, oh, well, there you go. So I click onto the story and find that this is a report on argument in the DC circuit about a very serious argument. The argument has to do with whether Trump can be prosecuted for his conduct while sitting as president of the United States. The United States recognizes a broad presidential immunity, placing the chief executive beyond the reach of criminal prosecution while he is in office. This is related to an ancient medieval doctrine called sovereign immunity, and basically says the sovereign is immune from suit because they are above they are above the law. That's the medieval notion. Of course, that flies straight in the face of our democratic and Republican principles that no one is above the law. And so Jack Smith has brought a prosecution against Donald Trump for his conduct in office related to the riot on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Trump's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss, basically saying that because Trump's conduct took place while he was president, this customary presidential immunity kicks into place, and no court has personal jurisdiction over Donald Trump. They can't reach it. They don't have subject matter jurisdiction over him because the subjects over which he was speaking or which he's been sued or prosecuted relate to his conduct as president. Judge Chutkin disagreed. Donald Trump took an appeal. It has resulted in a temporary postponement of the March trial. The DC Circuit held expedited argument yesterday, and as takes place in any appellate argument, judges started to ask hypothetical questions of the lawyers to test the limits of the principles being asserted in the case, to see whether the principles were coherent, to see what they might mean when applied to shocking circumstances, to see what just where the center of gravity lay. So Judge Pond apparently asked Trump's lawyer, "Are you saying that Donald Trump, could assassinate a rival with immunity?" And I think that the lawyer's response was, he could do so unless and until he'd been impeached. In other words, if he engaged in that sort of conduct and Congress impeached him and he was convicted, he could be prosecuted thereafter, but not otherwise. And so the liberal press, the mainstream media, legacy media, call it what you will, more or less wet itself in hysteria over this and created a series of headlines. This authoritarian thinks he can kill Joe. Quick, help, help.
Before you go on, I got to acknowledge our boy, A.R. Hoffman. A.R. Hoffman, I have I'm growing admiration for you. Look, the first couple of paragraphs of this New York Sun article are beautiful, Norm. The assertion by a lawyer for President Trump with his client and special counsel Jack Smith both in the room that a president could be protected from prosecution even if he ordered Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival underscores the stakes of the immunity issue for the trial of Mr. Trump and the prerogatives of the presidency. That hypothetical was posed to Mr. Trump's attorney, John Sauer, at a Tuesday morning hearing before the United States Court of Appeals for the District Court of Columbia. A panel of 3 writers heard arguments over whether they should overturn the ruling of District Court Judge Tanya Chutkin that a former president is not entitled to the immunities of his erstwhile office. That is unreal, though, to pose that hypothetical. But is it unreal, Norm? It's shocking to me. But in terms of argumentation and taking things to the logical extreme, acknowledging what precedent may or may not be set by the ruling, is that a reasonable hypothetical to pose?
I think hypotheticals are what they are. They you take a proposition. It's okay to cross against the red light, when circumstances require it. And there are exceptions to the rule that you have to stop. Are you saying, Mr. Pattis, that you could walk across a red light with 6 children who were deaf, dumb, and blind and being led and tethered to you by a rope, and you could do so regardless of their safety? Well, no, I'm not. That's not what this case is about. But you want to say, are there may be circumstances which, as a rule says, in order to save the life of the party crossing the street, you don't expect them to honor the red light if honoring it means they're going to die waiting for the light to change. So the argument would be in this case, well, if the lives of the 6 kids would be extinguished without crossing the street, yes, judge, we would do that. And then the judge will say, well, that's just impractical. You don't want to have deaf, dumb, and blind children crossing against red lights under the supervision of an adult. That's just not a reasonable rule of law. Well, judge, maybe it's not, but that's not the rule in this case. And you could create an exception for children. So I think what Sauer was saying in this argument is we have an immunity doctrine for a reason. And the reason is to free the chief executive to do his job without being tied down in inevitable and never-ending litigation from prosecutors who make who have bias, interests, and motives all their own, who could decide to prosecute. And I think that Sauer was artful in the sense that the point is that we don't create a chief executive and grant that executive powers with impunity. In other words, without consequence. We place him in a system of checks and balances, and unlike an ordinary citizen, the president can be impeached. If the House votes articles of impeachment, the Senate tries him. If 2/3 of the Senate vote to remove him from office, he's removed, and that is the check and balance. So I think, my answer to Judge Pond would at that point would have been, look, if he ordered SEAL Team 6 to do it and he was impeached and convicted, try him criminally, because clearly at that point he would have engaged in a high crime and misdemeanor in the eyes of a coordinate branch of government. But unless and until that decision is reached, there's not been a nuanced decision by people equipped to make political judgments, and we might be doing harm to the republic. And it's an absurd example, but and I don't think that Sauer should have taken it too seriously. But here's the thing that didn't get reported on, and it bears noting. Judge Pond is also the judge who in the D.C. Circuit had the broadest interpretation of obstruction of justice in the 18 U.S.C. 1512 cases. That's the case before the Supreme Court. On whether a statute designed to penalize obstructing with evidence in a hearing can be broadly applied to people who participate in a riot at the Capitol. Judge Pond said, of course you can. A corrupt purpose is anything that interferes with government. So Judge Pond is sort of given to extremes, I think, in this view. What I found bothersome about the reporting was that it was converted by way of headline in a way in such a way as to alarm those who think that Trump is coming to office to engage in some sort of Hitlerian coup d'etat, where he'll suspend due process and engage in acts of retaliation and go on some authoritarian toot, ending democracy as we know it. I think Sauer was arguing well within the lines, coloring well within the lines of settled constitutional doctrine. And the DC Circuit's got a difficult decision to make. I think that if it concludes that he could be prosecuted, that a president can be prosecuted for his conduct while in office, that's going to empower prosecutors nationwide to evaluate the conduct of a president and determine that in some instances he should be prosecuted. So, for example, theft of honest services or fraud. Would Lyndon Johnson and his administration have been subject to prosecution for lying about the Gulf of Tonkin rather? Well, they would be. That's an instance of fraud that involved theft of honest services, exposed many people in the United States to death. If a president makes a declaration that systemic racism drives the United States, would that person be subject to prosecution by a person who believes that's a lie and mere political prosecution? Yes. So the immunity doctrine is related to the political question doctrine. And I don't think anybody should look at yesterday's argument as an endorsement of the power to assassinate. Congress isn't going to settle for it. And if Congress does, that's I think that's Pond's point. What if you've got a captive House and a captive Senate, and a president does something truly outrageous? Are you saying at that point that a prosecutor can't bring the president to justice? And the answer might have to be yes, that this issue gets resolved at the polling place at the next general election. But if we're going to make lawfare, the law of the land, we're never going to get anything done. So, shame on CNN, shame on everybody else who wrote these inflammatory headlines. But maybe that's just the way it is. The law is complicated, and the press can't always get it right.
Lawyer Will's in the chat this morning. Good morning, Lawyer Will. He says, I listened to the oral argument yesterday. It's not wild for judges to ask about hypothetical edge cases, which is exactly why I teed up the question for Norm. He follows up, Norm, by saying legal journalism is so bad. I think legal may be a redundancy there. Journalism in general is pretty bad, but it's even more so when you have a specific competency in a certain subject matter, and then you have to watch other people who lack that report on it. Interesting phenomenon there. I can't remember what it's called. Somebody else can correct me.
Well, legal journalism is bad. I mean, there,
Legal
especially.
journalism in particular is bad. I think I'm just, making a joke about legal journalism. You could just leave legal off. Journalism is bad. I agree, Norm.
Well, I mean, and you and I, we bring our own biases. I'm sure there are folks who listen and say, "Oh, these guys, they're too conservative, they're too this, they're kind of nuts," and we might be, but at least we're honest about the assumptions that we bring to bear, and we're open to being corrected by folks. Which, by the way, I want to give a shout out to Artisan Well. Artisan Well sent us a link to a roster of all the campaign related cases that Trump brought and their status and how they were decided. Artisan, I printed it out. I'm going to give it a close look and study. I concede that I've not, and that sometimes I just adopt the talking point that there were scores of cases and Trump lost them all, as though to suggest that there was never really any fire beneath all that smoke. There may well have been some fire there, and it may well be that the smoke signals obscured the message. Artisan, well, I want to thank you for providing that. We'll do more.
Yeah,
So,
and I'll make sure to provide this link in the chats here as well as in the newsletter. So update on the newsletter before we transition to Judge Chutkan and swatting. Newsletter is going to go out tomorrow or Friday. The platform we've chosen I really really like. However, there is an onboarding process for upping the number of subscribers you can import as soon as you come in. And so Norm and I have surpassed that small subscriber threshold for import. So I don't want to send out a newsletter, Norm, to only a portion of our audience, as small as we might be. That just doesn't seem right, you know?
all right. Well, or we could have a bidding war. We could say, hey, people, if you want the newsletter, I bid a dime. Oh, that's way too much. 8 cents. No, a nickel. No, a penny. No, you got to pay me to read it. Okay, never mind. We're going to work on getting it out with a different platform. That requires me to do some work today. And anything that requires my work will almost always result in inevitable delay. So Judge Chutkan got swatted. Tanya Chutkan. She is the judge that's sitting on the Donald Trump case that was set to go to trial in March and has now been delayed in part because of the argument that we just discussed. Swatting incidents are up. Marjorie Taylor Greene got swatted over the holiday break. Another Republican was swatted not long ago. Campaign officials are becoming subject to increasing threats of violence. And there was an interesting story in the Washington Post that basically talked about violence on the increase against campaign related officials in the run up to the 2024 election. And it's funny. I stop every morning, about six or so, at a certain deli here in Connecticut on my way into the office to grab an egg sandwich and a coffee. And this morning, the proprietor of the place said 2020 looks at me. And this after a night of stormy weather where a tree blew down in our road and there was flooding in the area. 2024 is going to be wild, he says. And I'm like, well, that was a lot of rain last night. No, I'm talking about, I mean, oh, the election? Yeah. And before you know it, there's this gaggle of guys, and it's like, we're on the cusp of civil war. I think the only four Republicans in Connecticut must all have been gathered together at the deli there this morning. But these were people who were agitated, aggravated, angry about the perpetual litigation against Donald Trump and felt as though they were being disenfranchised by the repeated legal efforts to keep Trump off the ballot. And I marveled at that, and I came into the office, and I then read the Washington Post story that I'd bookmarked last night to read, and I think there is a sense across the country of grave apprehension. What's going to happen in the 2024 election season, especially if we end up with a rerun of Biden versus Trump. And so there was I can't recall who, but somebody in one of the stories says, "Oh, this just isn't the United States. We can't tolerate this." And I thought, well, that's just sort of ridiculous.
Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
you're
if you're
talking about the Wall Street Journal article, maybe.
no, I think it's a Washington Post piece, but that's
Oh, yeah,
fine.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, whether whether whatever it is, it was a good piece. But I got to thinking about violence in American politics, and I can't recall a time when we were less violent than we are now. If you consider the colonial reaction to Great Britain that ultimately led to a revolution, the Boston Tea Party, fighting, deaths, expropriation of property. You go to the founding of the Republic and the fight between Republicans and then Federalists at that point over what was a good life, the War of 1812, our contested relationships with France and Great Britain, the run up to the Civil War, the divisions between the free soil parties and those who wanted slavery in the new states and those who didn't, the Civil War itself. You come back to Reconstruction and the black codes and the South's attempted reintegration into the North. You tumble into the development of the labor movement, and the violence associated with that. You go into the World War I era and talk about the Alien Sedition Act, the Palmer raids, the rise of the left and the violence between left and right. You talk about the Great Depression and the near rise of fascism in the United States. And once again, I recommend to everybody Rachel Maddow's book on prequel. She does called Prequel. She does a fantastic job of sketching the rise of neo-Nazism in the country at that point. You get you get to World War II, a moment of rare harmony as we mobilized against an external threat. But even during that period, we engaged in seeming acts of institutional violence against people, Japanese and Germans. You go to the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and 70s, and the wide range of bombings across the country, multiple bombings per day in the United States. When has there been? And then you talk about the assassination in short order of John F. Kennedy, um, of Martin Luther King, the shooting of Malcolm X. Um, um, uh, when have we not had violence in this country? And when have we not been rubbed raw by our conflicting visions of the good? And when did it become a crime to talk passionately about your vision of things? I think this narrative about how violent people are becoming, about Trump as an authoritarian, is itself a form of institutional violence that is designed to silence criticism. And unless you are sort of a woke zombie, marching in unison with others saying, from this river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Go Hamas. Unless you're dribbling that sort of nonsense or you're adopting the woke campaign against microaggressions, you need to be silenced. And I think there is a growing number of, Dawn, remember the Republicans shot up Congress? Absolutely. Part of their separatist movement. I think there's a growing sense in the country among many people that they're not going to be silenced. And I couldn't help but wonder as I pondered this morning, whether the declining life expectancies in the United States and the increasing deaths of despair that are noticed in the white middle class and in particular white working middle class, deaths of despair. I'm talking about Angus Deaton and Ann Case's book that talked about the rise of death related to gun violence, suicide. Um, uh, Deaths incident to alcoholism and substance abuse and other forms of suicide, whether that was our turning our violence against ourselves as against one another. That we, as dissent is being stifled, people's sense of frustration and and the desire to manipulate their world to their benefit, all that energy has to go somewhere. And if you're forbidden to speak out, your rage turns within. And what do you destroy? You destroy yourself. Wake up, throw off those chains that lead you to self destruction. And if you see something, say something. If you see somebody spouting bullshit next to you, you're not required to say, they have a right to they have a right to be as full of shit as they want, and it's my obligation to take a good a good deep whiff of that bullshit and say, it smells good. No, it doesn't. There is an objective reality out there. There is a sense of communal expectations. There are some things that are better than others, and I think the rise of populism is an uprise in that frustration and a surge in that anger that says we're not going to tolerate it anymore. And I worry that as we go into 2024, the effort to suppress dissent is going to lead to a dissent overflowing, as it were, rather, in the direction of violence. And if it does, candidly, it will be just another violent chapter in the history of a violent nation. It won't be the end of the republic. And all these news stories about Donald Trump, the authoritarian, and whatnot, are just overdone and silly. As to the swatting of homes of public officials, that is a deeply grievous problem. It's irresponsible. Um, 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 and I don't know that it needs to stop. I mean, I remember as a kid, I shouldn't confess this, and I'll more about this in a minute, T girl. I don't know that I should confess this, but I'm going to. When we were kids, we used to send hearses to people's homes that we didn't like, and we'd sit across the street and watch the guys drive up to collect the dead body when no one was dead. Swatting is another form of that. Is it a crime? Yeah, and prosecuted, but it's certainly not the end of the republic. T Girl says, did Norm just suggest I buy a book written by Rachel Maddow? As a matter of fact, T Girl, I didn't. I didn't suggest that you buy it, but I am now. I think you should go out and buy that book and read it. It was. I have a loved one who is to the left of Mao and regards me as a source of curiosity. And they referred the book, and I wasn't going to read it, and I started, and it's a damn good book. I'm learning things about Father Coughlin that I didn't know. It inspired me to go out and buy another book, Charles Gallagher's Nazis of Copley Square, The Forgotten Story of the Christian Front. I'm watching the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States, saying, what's wrong with that? I mean, should we have atheistic internationalism? Should we have bottomless pluralism? Should we should we have no standards at all so that everyone feels safe and everybody's a winner? No, there are standards worth fighting for. So T Girl, go out and buy this book, or follow Dawn McNeil's recommendation. What is it?
No purchase necessary, right? That's it. So much going on in the chat here. It's tough to keep up. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for bringing the energy this morning. Lawyer Will, I'm spotlighting you again, my man. It's already extremely wild that the leading presidential contender is being prosecuted and attempts are being made to get him off the ballot. Actual attacks on quote unquote democracy. And I think I sent you a note this morning, Norm, sort of giving you my take on the just superfluous use of democracy coming from the political left. It's sickening, but it's also not new within the playbook. I've talked before about the screw tape letters and the particular chapter in there that talks about the use.
C.S. Lewis. Break C.S. Lewis down for people.
I'll have to go back because I don't want to paraphrase without remembering in a little more detail. But I do commend that to anybody that wants to pick up something that will give you a playbook that I see playing out right now, and it's from the perspective of a devil, right? This is the devil talking to an underling, right? Or a managerial devil talking to a devil in training, so to speak. And it goes through the rhetoric and tactics of taking someone's soul and bringing it to the underworld. And one of these tactics is a mass collectivization of personal interest, materialism, very libidinal cravings, et cetera, centering the self and extreme and unbridled narcissism. And one of these things on the topic of collectivism is the repetition of this thing called democracy, which, Norm, you and I connected out front a couple of years ago on this notion that nothing scares you quite so much as a self-righteous mob. And absolutely. A democracy without the acknowledgement of a republic, right? It is a democratic republic that is America, right? Democracy without that notion of a republic is unrestrained mob rule, right? And what we're seeing right now in the political left is, most people don't recognize the distinction that we're making, but those who do know are using it to their full advantage.
And here's a nerd alert. If you're wondering what we're talking about and you want to see history at work, take a look at G.J.A. Pocock, P-O-C-O-C-K's Machiavellian Moment. I think if the book was written in the 1970s, and it's an argument about Machiavelli as a civic republican. Basically, the notion that somehow in a republic, virtue strength, goodness, a sense of well-being. That is what grounds a republic, not desire, but virtue. And in a republic, the politics of virtue runs up against the desire of the masses and keeps the desire of the masses from running overboard and running over the interests of those who don't share their perspective and their values. So it's GJA Pocock, the Machiavellian moment. This is only for people like Lawyer Will and T-Girl, that is, serious students of history who would not be caught dead in a Starbucks with a copy of Rachel Maddox's prequel in their hands for fear that someone would think they've lost their senses and become a devotee to MSNBC. T-Girl, I want to assure you, I'd never watch MSNBC. And even my wife, who is to the left of me, said last night, who is Rachel Maddow again, by the way? So we're not exactly a media savvy household, but you got to know your enemy.
You should show your wife the movie 8 Mile and tell her that Eminem is Rachel Maddow. We've got a newer listener here. This is Buck Leva, Buckleva. Good morning, Buck Leva. Buckleva. I don't know how you want to
Buckleva. He's talking about those wonderful Greek treats.
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah.
Newer listener here. Can Norm give any update on the case of Guilford, Connecticut parents versus the Board of Education?
Yes, the Guilford Board of Education, the various parents versus Guilford Board of Education is a suit that arises out of a controversy in Guilford, which is one of the woke epicenters of Connecticut. Guilford's school board has adopted a policy of the 1619 as a project as American gospel, and teaches students about systemic racism and Ta-Nehisi Coates, how to be an effective anti-racist racist. Some parents were outraged by this and ran for the school board. When they ran for the school board, they lost because it is a woke epicenter. They have children in the school system, and those children have been the subject of retaliation and humiliation in the school district. So we brought an action against the school district on behalf of the kids. The case is pending in federal district court. Interrogatory requests have been served on the plaintiffs by the defendants. We are responding to them. We're getting in the process of preparing our interrogatory requests of the school district. Discovery will proceed to depositions sometime in the spring through the summer and early fall. I expect dispositive motions for summary judgment and whatnot to be filed later this year. And a court will decide whether there are enough issues to go to trial, probably in early 2025. So that's the update. There is another potential piece of litigation out there in New Haven right now. Yesterday, we get wind of the fact that members of the New Haven employees of the New Haven Board of Education just got a letter, an email, due to a generous grant through the Graustein, Graustein Memorial Fund. New Haven Public Schools can provide tuition and book support for current employees of color enrolled in a teacher certification program in the 23-24 school year. To equitably use these funds, we will distribute them evenly among those who qualify and complete a request. And then there are instructions on how to request money. Hello? Do we have a public institution saying white people need not apply? Whatever happened to equal protection of the law? So a teacher in New Haven arguably sent me this and said, is this against the law? And I said, well, it certainly raises questions about whether it violates the Equal Protection Clause. I don't know whether a teacher will come forward from within the New Haven School District who will make an application and be denied because the color of their skin is wrong. Candidly, I don't know enough about the Graustein Memorial Fund. I mean, a giver can set conditions on the gift that they give, and it can say we only want this to go to teachers of color. Question, can a school board then endorse a discriminatory gift? Don't know the answer to that either. So it may take litigation to find that out. But that's an example of race-based transfer payments, which Mike and I both oppose, and we've earlier called for a constitutional amendment to prohibit race-based transfer payments. And this is the sort of case that would give rise to that sort of litigation and claim.
T-Girl says, maybe I can go buy some Jack Smith merch at a pop-up store while I read some Maddow in a Starbucks.
If you do, I recommend that you buy. We're going to come out with a new product that's going to be called Jalapeno Jack. the pepper the pepper that inspires Jack Smith, because every time I see a picture of him, what's he doing? And you only make a face like that if you're going, man, what did I just swallow? It couldn't have been a line of Merrick Garland's bullshit, could it? It couldn't have been Joe Biden. Was it Kamala Harris in a rare moment of sobriety telling me what it was like to Willie Brown's what? I just don't know. Jalapeno Jack's peppers, not for everyone, only for the strong of heart.
I love that. I love that. Well, look, we've got a ton of different. I feel like we've got a surge of interest in stories that are getting at the heart of this sort of legitimation crisis being thrown into the chat this morning on both YouTube and Rumble. I was asked about whether we had heard, and this is Junior Coltrane. Let me go back to the comment asking if we had heard of the Vermont baking company that is having a contest that specifically excludes whites.
I did hear something about that. Yeah. What's the contest about, though? I don't remember.
So I've asked for a link there. If anybody has a link, please shoot it over. We can absorb that and perhaps take that on as well in conjunction with this Connecticut school and tuition, or books and tuition case. Because Norm, you sent me information about that, and we're a little off script, but I definitely want to kind of thread that needle if we can. I don't know that there's any question that would be a violation of equal protection. And you don't have to try very hard, but I know that you're very specific about how you use the term equal protection and whether it's violative. But anytime the public tax dollars are going to fund something that is discriminatory on its face, I would think that there's a little bit of an issue, and it's an indirect public tax dollars, right? Even if there's somebody sponsoring it, using the school board system to promote it and then also to push it into salaried employees of that school system is discriminatory. So
it appears to be it. I'd be an interesting issue to litigate. I don't know whether somebody's going to come forward and want to do that. Dawn asks, do we think that the right is being consistent in protecting free speech when it comes to the Israeli Hamas Palestinian issues? Dawn, this is a very tough issue for me. I am ardently a supporter of Israel and believe that the Judeo-Christian tradition is the backbone of Western civilization, and that Israel is an enclave of Western civilization, candidly. I also believe in Israel's right to exist. I believe that the Palestinians have systemically mishandled any claim to statehood that they would have had, because they've had it for 100 years and have never decided to build upon what the United Nations and others offered them. What they decided to do was set their sights on the destruction of Israel, because Israel is composed largely of Jews. And that is a form of anti-Semitism that, to my mind, reflects what I call the bottom falling out of pluralism. There comes a point in time where you can't tolerate everything, and tolerance of the intolerable is indefensible. I believe that tolerating or supporting Hamas's terrorism and savagery with respect to Israel on October 7th is intolerable. And so I think that while I respect the right of those to speak, and I would have defended the Nazis marching in Skokie, I don't think I'd defend a Hamas person speaking out on the right to destroy Israel. That's a choice that I would make. I wouldn't penalize another person who chose to defend that person. But when it comes to these values, here I stand, and I think Hamas should be destroyed. And every time I read a report of another Hamas official executed or assassinated, the first thought that comes to mind is AMF yo-yo, which is what we used to say to one another when we left college. Adios, motherfucker. You're on your own.
I understand the origins of the question, Dawn, I think, and I'd probably answer it a little bit differently than Norm. Norm, you've been exceedingly clear on where you stand on these things, and I'm still quite restrained. Number one, I think the question is tough to answer just because of the addition of Palestinian at the latter portion of that, and I've been very wary, Dawn, of the transmutation of Hamas into Palestine broadly, and then the plight of an oppressed people that is Palestine, at least in popular culture and popular consciousness, as being a bludgeon upon which to exact the same sort of pressure, money, sort of change via legislation, et cetera, that we saw with BLM behind the summer of 2020. And so when you ask the question, I'm assuming you are seeing that there is some inconsistency with the application of the First Amendment and free speech principles from the political right. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would suggest that you're probably right about that. But again, being right about, whether you're inconsistent is not the same as necessarily being a hypocrite. You can intend to do that, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the consistency for consistency. Who was it that once said consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds? Was that H.L. Mencken? I can't remember. Or was it G.K. Chesterton? Or was it neither? Quick, one of you wits, give us the answer so we can wrap up today and say goodbye.
Well, okay. Last part here, and we'll get out of here. What about the conflation of anti-Israel sentiment with being supportive of Hamas, kicking pro-Palestinian groups off campuses? Right. And look, not saying that any of this is well designed or precise, but I think that you're correct to sense that. I'm not sure what the hell to make of it. I'm just concerned that we have a very and in fact, we talked about the Anis Stepman article from the American Mind yesterday, Norm. And what my concern is primarily that the younger demographics um, are sympathetic to that conflation, right? That is the issue.
I think, Dawn, this is one of the issues that we pointed out to as the most important issue. One of the issues we'll be following through the course of the year. I'm not sure where I stand on it. I'm confused and working my way through it. I think that fundamental changes will occur as a result of this conflict, and the American psyche will look different at the end of the year as a result of this.
Well,
Hey,
it's a nick against Ron DeSantis as well, because while he was in Florida, he was also supporting and helping pass legislation that was sort of the uh, hate speech bill that talked specifically about anti-Israel sentiments. Right? He also was a part of the legislation where they attempted to have journalists register to be journalists with the state government. So I do think that there is plenty of hypocrisy to point out on the political right within this context, for sure.
Julian Toll, who I believe hails from Australia, took in Australia to educate we North Americans that it was Ralph Waldo Emerson who once wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines." Well done, Julian. Well done, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And it's important to notice that consistency for consistency's sake isn't necessarily a virtue. It can be foolish. We see you, Junior Coltrane. I don't think it was Mark Twain. So I see you're saying it was Samuel Clemens. But I think Mr. Toll is correct. But you know what? We'll look at it today and we'll report on it tomorrow. Dawn Knight notes that life is empty since fantasy football is over. So thanks for these podcasts. Dawn, just because we didn't give you credit, was she in second place this year?
Numero dos.
Dawn, you kicked our ass. You gloated about it. And now you're missing the privilege of kicking our ass. We loved having our asses kicked by you. And I've been trying to get Mike to create a fantasy baseball league, but
not happening. It's not happening. Unless I can draft David Justice, it's not happening,
All right. Well, listen, folks, we've talked our way through enough of your time today. Thanks for listening. Mike, how do folks find us?
You can find us every day on X at LawPod Daily. You can also find us on Rumble and YouTube. Live at LawPod Daily, Law and Legitimacy. You can also find us at lawpoddaily.com. For all of the audio-only podcasts, Norm, they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, Audible, wherever you find premium podcasts, we're there. Leave us 5 stars and a nice review, or leave us alone. And until tomorrow, Norm, have a great day. Go get them.
I will. You too, Mike. Be well, everybody. Talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you, everyone.